The wind howled across the barren prairie, dragging with it loose curls of dust that stung Lena's cheeks. Her boots, worn thin from weeks of walking, scuffed against the hard, frozen earth. All she had left in the world was a frayed carpet bag slung over her shoulder, and even that felt heavier than it should, carrying only a change of clothes and a folded photograph of a man she once called her husband. She hadn't cried when the landlord slammed the door in her face 2 weeks ago. She'd stood there in the cold, clutching her bag, listening to the bolt slide into place. There was no point in pleading. Rent was rent, and she hadn't been able to pay it since the crops failed and work dried up. The little room she'd once made into a home now belonged to someone else. The sky was gray, thick with the promise of snow, and the wind seemed to push her forward whether she wanted to move or not. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a constant, dull ache she'd grown used to ignoring. She'd stretched her last crust of bread over 3 days, and that had been gone since yesterday morning. Still, she kept walking. It was the only thing left to do. By the time she spotted the faint outline of a small western town in the distance, her knees were trembling. She paused on a ridge to take it in, a handful of buildings huddled together, smoke curling from chimneys, horses tied along the hitching posts. It wasn't much, but to her, it looked like a place where maybe, just maybe, she could rest for a while. Her boots crunched over gravel as she descended into the outskirts. A few townsfolk looked her way, their gazes curious but guarded. She was used to it. A woman alone always drew whispers, and she could practically hear the questions behind her eyes. Where's her husband? Why is she on the road? Lena kept her chin up, though the weight of their stares pressed heavy on her shoulders. Passing the livery stable, she caught the warm scent of hay and horses, a sharp contrast to the icy wind. For a moment, she slowed, letting the smell remind her of better times. Her late husband fixing harness straps, the sound of hooves on packed dirt, the gentle nicker of their mare. But memories were dangerous things. They made her heart ache in ways the cold never could. She found herself near the edge of the main street, where a small cafe's windows glowed with lamplight. The smell of coffee drifted out every time someone opened the door. Her stomach twisted painfully, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if that could quiet the hunger. She had no coins to spend, and the thought of walking inside and being told to leave was too much to bear. Instead, she turned toward a narrow alley between 2 buildings, where the wind didn't bite quite as hard. She sat on an old crate, hugging her bag to her chest. For now, she just needed to rest, just for a minute, before deciding where to go next. She told herself she wasn't looking for pity, only a chance to work, to eat, to sleep without fear being turned out. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was desperate, and desperation had a way of making a person take risks they never thought they would. Somewhere in the distance, a door swung open and shut, boots thudded against a wooden walk, and a low voice carried through the cold. She didn't know it yet, but the man walking toward her, tall, broad-shouldered, with a shadow of stubble and a weathered coat, was about to change everything. The sound of boots on the wooden walk grew louder until Lena looked up from where she sat hunched against the cold. A man was standing a few paces away, his broad shoulders outlined against the pale winter sky. He wore a long, weathered coat that looked as though it had seen 100 storms, and his hat was pulled low over eyes the color of worn leather, steady, watchful, but not unkind. "You'll freeze. Sit out here," he said, his voice low and carrying the easy drawl of plains. Before she could answer, he stepped to the side and pulled something from his saddlebag, a thick woolen blanket. He held it out without pushing it toward her, as if giving her the choice. Lena's first instinct was to refuse. Kindness from strangers had a way of turning into debts, and debts were dangerous. Still, the warmth promised by that blanket made her fingers ache all the more. "I'm fine," she said quietly, rubbing her hands together. It was a lie they both could see through. The cowboy's gaze dipped to her empty hands and then back up to her face. "Come on," he said after a moment, jerking his chin toward the cafe across the street. "A hot meal's waiting in there. My treat." She hesitated, glancing at the passers-by. A few had slowed just enough to watch. One older woman whispered to her companion, and Lena caught the faintest murmur. "That's Eli Carter. Kind man, but trouble follows him." The warning was soft, but sharp enough to make her pause. Eli seemed to notice her wariness. "Don't mean you harm, ma'am. Just figure a person shouldn't go hungry in weather like this." There was no pity in his tone, only a quiet certainty that made it hard to turn away. Hunger finally made the choice for her. She rose slowly, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "Just a meal," she said firmly, meeting his gaze so he'd understand. "Nothing more." He gave a single nod. "Just a meal," he agreed, as though sealing a bargain. They crossed the street together, the icy wind biting less now that she had someone walking beside her. Inside, the cafe was warm and smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Eli led her to a small table in the corner, out of direct view of the door. He ordered without asking her preference. Beef stew and cornbread for two, with coffee strong enough to chase the cold from her bones. She watched him from across the table as they waited, noting the small things. The way his hands were roughened from years of rope and reins, the faint scar along his jaw, the way he kept his back to the wall as if it were a habit. He was polite, quiet, not the overbearing sort she'd learned to avoid. When the food came, Lena tried to pace herself, but the rich smell of the stew overpowered her restraint. She ate in silence, each spoonful thawing something deep inside her. Eli didn't speak much either, though his eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite read. Maybe recognition, maybe concern. After the meal, she pushed her bowl away and straightened. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm again, "for the food." "You'll take the blanket, too," he said, sliding across the table. She shook her head. "No, you've done enough." For a moment, it looked like he might argue, but instead he leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Suit yourself, ma'am. Just stay warm wherever you end up." Lena stood, gathering her bag. Part of her wanted to linger in the cafe's warmth, but lingering could lead to expectations. She'd learned to leave before that happened. With one last nod, she stepped outside into the biting wind. Behind her, Eli Carter stayed at the table, watching through the window as she walked away. Trouble might follow him, as the townsfolk said, but something in the way she kept her head high despite the cold made him think trouble had already found her long before they'd met. The Carter Ranch sat at the edge of the valley, a stretch of weathered pasture framed by split-rail fences and silent hills. Once, the place had been full of life, the clatter of hooves in the yard, laughter spilling from the porch, the smell of biscuits drifting from the kitchen. But those days were gone. Now, Eli rode to the gate alone, the only sounds a creak of saddle leather and the slow, heavy thud of his horse's steps. Inside the main house, the air was still. He hung his coat by the door, its weight heavier with the memory of the meal he'd shared earlier with the woman in town. Her guarded eyes lingered in his mind longer than he cared to admit. He pushed the thought away, busying himself with stoking the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. By late afternoon, the first drops of rain turned to sleet, pelting the windows. A storm was moving in fast, the kind that swallowed the plains whole, turning roads to rivers and pastures to swamps. Eli checked the barn, making sure the doors were latched and the horses had fresh hay. That's when he saw her. Lena was huddled in the corner of an empty stall, her shawl pulled tight, the hem of her skirt dark with water. Her small bag sat beside her, soaked through. She looked up sharply when he stepped inside, as if ready to defend her spot against whoever had found her. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. She didn't answer right away, only hugged herself tighter. "The wind came up fast," she finally said. "I was just looking for somewhere dry." He scanned the rafters dripping with meltwater, the damp straw at her feet. "This ain't dry," he muttered, pulling off his coat. He held it toward her. "Come on. You'll freeze if you stay out here." She shook her head. "I'll be fine." Eli stepped closer, lowering his tone. "Ma'am, this storm's only getting worse. I've got fire going in the house. You can sit by till the rain lets up." Her eyes darted toward the open barn doors, where the sleet fell in silver sheets. Pride was a stubborn thing, but cold had a way of breaking it down. Finally, she nodded, letting him drape the coat over her shoulders. They crossed the yard quickly, boots splashing through puddles. Inside, the heat from the fire hit her like a wall. Eli guided her toward the hearth, where a braided rug softened the wood floor. "You can set your bag by the stove, dry it out some," he said, moving toward the kitchen. "I'll fetch a towel." While he stepped away, Lena took in a room. The house was sturdy but worn, its furniture simple and well used. Dust lingered on the mantel, and a single photograph sat by the window. A younger Eli with another man, both grinning, arms slung over each other's shoulders. When he returned, she accepted the towel, rubbing her hands and face. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly. "You're not intruding," Eli replied, pulling up a chair. "Storm like this, you'd be foolish to ride it out in a barn." An awkward quiet fell between them. The wind roared outside, making the walls creak. Lena watched the flames curl and snap, feeling the warmth seep back into her bones. Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees, as if he wanted to say more but wasn't sure how. Finally he spoke. "You got anywhere to go after this?" Her eyes stayed on the fire. "I'll manage." Eli didn't press. He learned that some stories only came out when a person was ready. Instead, he pushed a mug of steaming coffee toward her. "Drink. It'll help." She wrapped her fingers around the cup, the heat almost too much for her chilled skin. "Thank you," she murmured. For the rest of the evening, the storm battered the ranch, but inside, the two of them sat in companionable silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Neither would admit it, but something unspoken had begun, a thin thread of trust, spun in the quiet between strangers. By morning, the storm had eased, leaving the yard glistening under a thin sheen of frost. The air was sharp and bright, carrying the smell of wet earth. Lena woke on the small settee near the fire, her shawl still wrapped tight, the embers casting a faint orange glow. She sat up, smoothing her hair, aware of the silence in the room, and the fact she'd spent the night in a stranger's home. From the kitchen came the sound of metal clinking against enamel. Eli was already up, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "Morning," he said without looking at her, as if the word itself was routine. She nodded back, uncertain. "I should go," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. "Road's still a mess," Eli replied, setting one mug in front of her. "But if you're set on leaving, I'm not stopping you." He took a seat opposite, his gaze steady but not unkind. Lena wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers. I don't have money for another night indoors," she admitted. "But I can work. Cook, clean, help with the animals." Eli raised an eyebrow. "You know your way around a barn?" "My father had mules," she said, meeting his eyes for the first time that morning. "I can handle myself." He hesitated, then gave a single nod. "All right, you earn your keep. You can stay until the weather clears." They began in the barn, the boards still damp from the storm. Lena gathered eggs from the henhouse, careful not to slip in the mud, while Eli carried bales of hay to the horses' stalls. She worked with quiet efficiency, sleeves rolled to her elbows, not afraid to get her hands dirty. Eli watched from the corner of his eye, expecting hesitation, but she surprised him with how naturally she moved among the animals. By midday, she had a pot of stew simmering in the kitchen. The scent of onions and herbs filled the air, replacing the usual smell of cold ash and dust. Eli, seated at the table mending a bridle, glanced toward the stove more than once. "You've been busy," he remarked. "It's why I said I'd do," Lena replied, ladling the stew into bowls. "I'm not one to take charity without giving something back." They ate without hurry, the silence between them now less awkward, more companionable. At one point, Eli told her about the stubborn rooster he'd had since he was a boy, and she laughed, a soft, unexpected sound that seemed to warm the room more than the fire. That evening, she mended a torn shirt while he cleaned his rifle by the hearth. Their conversations were still small, about weather, about chores, about the cattle he used keep, but there was an ease creeping in, a faint thread of comfort. Before turning in, Eli spoke almost as if thinking aloud. "Most folks I met blow through here without looking back. Guess I didn't expect you to stay." Lena folded the shirt and set it on the table. "Maybe I didn't expect to, either." The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows on the walls. It wasn't friendship yet, not trust, but there was something there, mutual respect, a shared quiet, and for the first time in weeks, neither felt entirely alone. The next time Lena rode into town with Eli for supplies, she felt the weight of eyes on her before they even reached the general store. Two women paused mid-conversation outside the dress shop, their glances darting toward her like sharp needles. Across the street, the blacksmith's apprentice leaned on his hammer a little too long, whispering something to a passing ranch hand. Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of flour and oil lamps, but also with curiosity. Mrs. Hill, the storekeeper's wife, offered Lena a polite smile, too polite, as if she were trying to hide a thought she didn't approve of. Lena kept her head down, focusing on the list in her hands, but she could hear the low voices from the next aisle. "That cowboy took in a strange woman," one voice murmured. "Not the first time troubles followed him," another replied. By the time they left, Lena's cheeks were warm, her stomach twisted in a way no cold wind could cause. She kept quiet on the ride back, her hands clutched in her lap. Eli noticed. "Something's chewing at you," he said, guiding the wagon over a rutted stretch of road. "It's nothing," she lied, though her voice betrayed her. He gave her a side glance, calm but unblinking. "Let me guess. Folks flapping their jaws?" Lena hesitated, then nodded. "They think—" "I don't know what they think, but I don't want to cause you trouble." "Trouble?" Eli snorted softly, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I've had real trouble, Lena. This—" He shook his head. "This is just wind, and wind dies down." His words were simple, but they carried a steadiness that made her chest loosen a little. Still, the whispers clung to her mind like burrs in a skirt hem. That night, as she sat by the fire mending socks, she caught herself wondering if Eli's neighbors were right to talk. Not because of anything improper, but because kindness like his always seemed to come at a cost. The days settled into their rhythm again, but Lena began noticing something new. After supper, when most men would rest, Eli would disappear into barn. At first, she thought he was checking the animals, but the faint sound of hammering and sanding reached her ears long after the chores should have been finished. One evening, she stepped outside, shawl wrapped tight against the cold, and saw the barn light flickering through the cracks in the boards. The rhythmic scrape of wood on wood filled the air. She almost went to the door, curiosity tugging at her, but something in her told her to wait. When Eli returned much later, his hands were dusted with sawdust, his hair a little mussed. He didn't mention what he'd been doing, and she didn't ask. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the wind whistle through the eaves, she found herself wondering what a man like Eli could be building in secret, and why he worked on it only after the rest of the world had gone quiet. The day began like any other, gray sky, cold air, and the steady rhythm of chores that made the winter bearable. Lena had just finished sweeping the kitchen when the sound of hooves crunched on the frozen dirt outside. She wiped her hands on her apron and peeked through the curtain. A man she hadn't seen in months swung down from his horse, his long coat flapping in the wind. Her breath caught. It was Mr. Sloane, her former landlord. She hadn't thought about him since the day she'd been evicted, but the sight of his narrow, fox-like face brought the memory rushing back. The humiliation of standing outside her little rented home with nowhere to go still stung. The knock at the door was sharp and impatient. Before Lena could move, Eli opened it. "Can I help you?" His voice carried the same steady calm she'd come to know, though his eyes sharpened at the sight of the man. "I've come for what's mine," Sloane said, pushing past any attempt at politeness. "This woman owes me 3 months' rent. I want payment now." His gaze slid over to Lena like a snake testing the air. Eli's stance changed, subtle, but enough to make Sloane pause. "If you got business with her, you got business with me," Eli said evenly. "And I'm telling you, she doesn't owe you a thing out here." "That debt is still hers," Sloane pressed, his voice rising. "Unless you plan to buy it off her." Eli stepped forward, the porch boards creaking under his boots. "She's not yours to harass, and you do well to ride out of here before you say something you'll regret." The two men stared at each other for a long, tense moment. Sloane's eyes flicked to Lena, as if hoping she'd speak, but she stayed silent, fingers twisting in her apron. Finally, Sloane spat on the ground, turned on his heel, and mounted his horse. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Lena let out the breath she'd been holding. "You didn't have to," she began. "Yes," Eli cut in, looking directly at her. "I did." Her eyes burned, though she wasn't sure if it was anger, shame, or something else entirely. "Eli, I don't want to be trouble for you." "You're not trouble," he said simply, and that was the end of it, at least for him. For Lena, the words lodged deep in her chest, warm and unsettling. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and howling through the chimney. The storm rolled in fast, bringing sleet that stung against the glass. Lena tried to sleep, but the barn light kept flickering in her mind. Somewhere out there, in the freezing dark, Eli was still working. She imagined him hunched over whatever secret project he kept hidden from her, sawdust in his hair, the smell of fresh-cut wood in the cold air. She didn't know what he was building, but she felt certain now it wasn't for himself. The storm passed overnight, leaving the ranch wrapped in a brittle silence. Icicles hung like glass teeth from the eaves, and the snow crunched loud beneath Lena's boots as she made her way toward the barn. She hadn't planned to spy. She told herself she was only checking on the animals, but curiosity had been tugging at her for days. That flicker of lamplight, the sound of steady hammering after dark. She needed to know. When she eased the barn door open, a gust of cold air slipped inside. Eli was there, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his breath fogging in the dim light. His hands, rough and steady, were sanding the arm of a half-finished rocking chair. Beside it, stacked neatly, were planks of wood and a pile of worn nails. In the far corner, she spotted something else. The guest room door leaning against the wall, its fresh coat of white paint gleaming against the old barn boards. "You've been busy," she said softly, surprising herself. Eli looked up, startled but not annoyed. "You weren't supposed to see it yet." His voice held a mix of embarrassment and pride. "What is all this?" she asked, stepping closer. The rocking chair wasn't fancy, but it was strong, each joint fitted with care. She ran her fingers along the smooth wood, feeling the warmth where he'd just been working. He set the sandpaper down and straightened. "The chair's for the front porch. Thought maybe you'd like to sit out there come spring." He hesitated, then nodded toward the door. "And the room, I've been fixing it up. Fresh paint, a real bed, curtains. Figured you could use a space of your own. Somewhere that's yours." Her throat tightened. "Why?" The word came out more brittle than she intended. Eli's gaze held hers without wavering. "Because you've been carrying everything you own in that little bag. Because I want you to have more than just a place to stay. I want you to feel like you belong here." The truth of it hit her harder than she expected. She couldn't remember the last time someone had wanted her to belong anywhere. Not since before her husband passed. Not since before the long stretch of loss and empty rooms that had followed. She blinked rapidly, but the sting behind her eyes wouldn't fade. "No one's ever done something like this for me." "It's nothing special," Eli murmured, looking away as if uncomfortable with the weight of her gratitude. "Just wood and paint." "No," she said firmly, stepping closer. "It's not nothing. You're giving me something I haven't had in a long time." She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Home." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The barn smelled of cedar and winter air, and the quiet between them was full, not empty like it used to be. Eli cleared his throat, almost gruff. "It's not finished yet, but it will be soon." Lena gave a small smile, the first in days. "Then I guess I'll just have to stick around to see it." The words hung there, gentle but certain, and Eli's answering smile was slow, cautious, but real. The next morning dawned pale and gray, a thin mist curling over the fields like breath. Inside the house, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Lena stood at the kitchen table, folding clean linens for the newly painted guest room, when Eli walked in with a basket of firewood. His coat was dusted with frost, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "You did have to wash those," he said, setting the basket down. "I wanted to," she replied without looking up. "Besides, it feels good, making a place look lived in." There was a quiet between them. Not the awkward silence of strangers, but the tentative calm of people who were still learning each other's edges. After a moment, Eli poured 2 mugs of coffee and sat across from her. "You've been carrying more than just that little bag," he said, his voice low but steady. "I can see it in your eyes." Lena's hands froze over the folded sheet. "It's not a story anyone in town needs to hear." "I'm not anyone in town," he replied simply. Something in his tone, steady, unhurried, patient, chipped away at the wall she'd built around herself. She sat down, wrapping her fingers around the warm mug. "After my husband died, I tried to keep our little home, but the bills kept coming. I sold what I could, but it was never enough. People were kind at first, but that kindness fades when you can't pay back what you owe. Eventually, the landlord decided he'd done enough waiting. He locked me out. Everything I had left fit in one bag." Eli didn't interrupt. He just listened, his eyes never leaving hers. "I walked for days," she continued, her voice trembling despite herself, "hoping for work, for somewhere to sleep. The nights were the worst, not because of the cold, but because there was nothing to wake up for." She stopped, swallowing hard. "I don't think I realized how lonely I'd become until I ended up here." Eli leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable but soft. "I know something about that kind of lonely." Lena glanced at him, curious. "My parents died in a wagon accident when I was 20, he said quietly. "The ranch was theirs. I stayed because it was all I had left of them, but a house with no voices in it. It starts to feel like it's swallowing you. Some days I wouldn't speak to anyone for weeks. I figured that was just life now." Her heart ached at the thought of him in this big, empty place, carrying his grief in silence. That's a heavy way to live. He gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It was easier to fix fences than to fix what was in here," he said, tapping his chest. They sat there, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock. The air between them shifted, warmer, charged. "Eli," she began, but her voice faltered. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "You don't have to say anything." Her breath caught. I'm not used to someone looking at me like I matter." "You do matter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The word sank deep, and before she could think better of it, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hand turned, rough palm meeting hers, holding it gently as if afraid she might vanish. For a moment, they just looked at each other, her pulse quickening, his gaze steady but soft. The space between them seemed to narrow, without either of them moving. His eyes flicked to her lips, then back to her eyes. Her heart hammered. She didn't know if she wanted to close the distance or hold on to the ache of almost, that fragile moment before something changes forever. Then, as if sensing her hesitation, Eli slowly let her hand go. The moment broke, but the warmth lingered. "Guess we should finish that room," he said, his voice a little rougher than before. "Yeah," she whispered, forcing a small smile. But as they stood and began working side by side, she knew something had shifted between them. The walls were thinner now, and it was only a matter of time before they fell completely. The night was cold enough to frost the edges of the windows, the kind of still winter, quiet, where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Inside the house, the fire and hearth burned low, throwing a soft amber glow across the room. Lena sat in the old rocking chair Eli had fixed for her, mending one of his work shirts by hand. Eli was at the table, cleaning and oiling a well-used pair of spurs. Every now and then, his eyes drifted to her, the way her hair caught the firelight, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He'd gotten used to the sound of her humming while she worked, and the thought of this house without it made his chest ache. Finally, he set the spurs aside. "Lena," he said quietly. She looked up, needle paws mid-stitch. He leaned forward in his chair, elbows resting on his knees. "You've been here a while now. Cooking, working, keeping the place running. You've made it feel alive again." She smiled faintly. "It's the least I can do after you took me in." "That's just it," he said, his voice lower now. "I don't want it to be the least you can do. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything. I want you here because you want to be here." Her smile faded into a stillness. Eli. He ran a hand over the back of his neck, searching for the right words. I'm not much for fancy speeches. I don't have a ring or flowers, or any of the things most folks think you're supposed to have. But I know what I've got, and that's this ranch, my word, and whatever's left of my heart. And I want to give it all to you. The fire popped softly, filling the pause between them. I'm asking you, he said finally, steady and certain. Stay? Not as my guest, not as a hired hand. Stay as my partner. My wife. For a moment, she just stared at him, the words settling in like warm sunlight on cold skin. The firelight made shadows dance across his face, but his eyes were clear and unwavering. Her throat tightened. You mean that? I've never meant anything more, he said. Something inside her, the part that had been cold and wandering for so long, seemed to melt. All those nights on the road, all the doors that had shut her face, all the lonely mornings she'd woken with nothing but the sound of her own breathing, all felt like it had led her here, to this quiet moment. She set the half-mended shirt aside and stood. For a second, she just looked at him, the man who had given her shelter when she had nothing, who had listened without judgment, who had seen her as more than a burden. Yes, she whispered. I'll stay. I'll be your wife. Eli stood too, his expression shifting from tense hope to quiet relief. He stepped closer, and though neither of them moved quickly, they ended up in each other's arms. His coat smelled faintly of leather and cedar smoke. They didn't speak for a long while, just held on to each other as the fire crackled softly behind them. Outside, the winter night pressed in cold and unforgiving. But in here, in his arms, Lena felt a warmth that went deeper than the hearth. When they finally stepped back, Eli cleared his throat with a small smile. Guess I should start fixing up the rest of the house. Lena laughed through the tears that had gathered in her eyes. Guess I should start making it a home. And as the firelight danced across the walls, it felt as though the old ranch and the hearts inside it had finally found their shelter. The late winter sun was soft that morning, brushing the frost on the grass in a slow, golden sweep. Eli stood by the old oak at the edge of the ranch yard, his best shirt buttoned up and hair combed, though a stubborn strand refused to stay down. Lena, wearing a simple ivory dress she'd sewn herself, walked toward him. There were no grand decorations, no organ music, just the smell of fresh hay, the sky stretching wide above, and a handful of neighbors who'd come to witness. Reverend Jacobs, an old friend of Eli's late parents, stood between them with a Bible in hand. His voice was low and steady as he spoke the vows, but Eli barely heard the words. His focus was on the way Lena's eyes shone, not with tears, but with a light that seemed to banish every shadow of the life she'd known before. When the Reverend finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Eli leaned down, his hand warm against her cheek, and kissed her gently. The neighbors clapped and cheered, the sound carrying out over the open land like a blessing. After the small celebration, they sat for a while on the porch, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs. The rocking chair Eli had built for her creaked softly in the breeze. Lena reached out to run her hand along its smooth armrest, smiling. "Someday," she murmured, "this might hold more than just me." Eli glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Someday," he agreed, his voice warm with a promise. The days that followed were filled with quiet joy, shared meals, long talks by the fire, and work on the ranch that no longer felt like a burden. Lena planted flowers by the porch, while Eli mended fences and whistled as he worked. It was a simple life, but it was theirs. One crisp afternoon, Eli saddled up his bay gelding, and Lena climbed onto her chestnut mare. They rode out across the land together, the field stretching wide and open under a sky so blue it seemed endless. The air smelled of cedar and clean earth, and their horses moved in an easy rhythm side by side. Eli reached over and took her hand, their fingers linking naturally, as if they'd been holding on for years. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The land, the sky, and the warmth of each other's presence said more than words ever could. As they crested a rise, the whole of the ranch lay before them. The house, the barn, the fields ready for spring. It wasn't just a place to live anymore. It was a home. Their home. They rode on toward the horizon, the sun low and glowing gold, casting long shadows that stretched ahead like a promise. And in that moment, with the wind in their hair and the world wide open before them, Eli and Lena knew whatever lay ahead, they would face it together,